Hello. Today I'm going to give you another review of one of the books I read in my Library of America collection. I've been going through the Library of America in, kind of 100 pages at a time in my podcast, American Writers 100 Pages at a Time. But I thought I would start giving briefer reviews of these works on YouTube. For people who might prefer this format or don't need the full, the long form format I have there. So I'm trying to be a little bit shorter here. So, Melvilles Typee, we'll start with that. This is actually the very first volume published by the Library of America when they started back in the 1980s, I think 82 or 83 or something. Now, up to now, I think they published more than 300 volumes. And I have about 120 of them. But this is the first one that they published. Not surprising that Melville, one of America's greatest writers, it was first on their agenda to get out. And it did it chronologically, so we just have in this volume the first three books published by Herman Melville: Typee, Omoo, and Marty. Of these, I think Typee is the only one that's commonly read today. It's the only one I've ever seen kind of on the bookshelf at just a regular bookstore in a literature department. Marty, I think, is almost never read, and people tend not to seem to like it. But I'll give you my comments on Marty later on. And I really like Omoo for a lot of reasons. But Typee is one of the ones that if you're not reading Moby Dick or Barnaby the Scrivener or Billy Budd, you might be reading Typee as representative of Melville's work. So, Typee is it was the most popular book he wrote while he was alive as well. Until the Melville revival of the early 20th century, really Typee was the one work that sort of survived. And some of his other works really didn't sell at all, including Moby Dick, but Typee was one of the more successful works that he wrote. And that's why for a while after he writing Typee kind of kept in the same format. So Omoo has a lot in common with Typee, and that it's quasi-autobiographical. It's very much an adventure story of the sea in the South Pacific. Marty, he tries to do something new, and when that fails, he goes back to kind of more classic, traditional adventure stories at sea with Redburn and Whitejacket before finally writing Moby Dick. So those are his 6 sea novels, and there's Billy Budd, which was published after he died. And now, one thing to remember about Melville is that his writing career was relatively short. He did jot things down throughout his life, but it's really between 1846, and about a little bit over a decade after that he published all of his major novels. And after that, he became essentially like a government worker at the port, like a customs agent. So partially his own decline, partially it was he wasn't being received very well, and for other reasons. I'm not really up to speed on every aspect of Melville's biography. I just find it striking that so much of his work, or all his work essentially, came in like the early part of what for many writers would have been the early part of his career. And he's basically retired from writing and worked for the government for a time, and partially because he wasn't really well received and he couldn't really make an income from his writing. This is not the only way Melville's biography matters when we look at his works, especially when you're looking at Typee and Omoo and Redburn and Whitejacket. These are novels that come right from his life. They're drawn directly from his life. Melville himself in 1842 was at sea on a whaling vessel in the South Pacific, and he deserts. And he deserts in the Marquesas, which is where Typee is set. And in the Marquesas, he actually lives for a brief period of time with some of the indigenous people there before finding travel on another whaling ship, which he takes off on that. Now, everything in the novel is a bit exaggerated and overblown, but a lot of it's also grounded in the experiences and the things he witnessed in the Marquesas. So even though the events of the novel stretch over a longer period of time than what really happened to Melville, they are rooted in experiences he had. So it is a quasi-autobiographical novel. After leaving the Marquesas, Melville went on another whaling ship, and he traveled around, and those events help inform the novel Omoo. Then he later on serves on a naval vessel, and he does other things in his life. It's not till 1940, 1845 and 1846 that he writes down Typee and he gets it published. So Typee was originally published in 1846 in the United States, and I think simultaneously under a different press in Great Britain. The major character in the novel is a man we know only as Tomu, Tommoo. This is what the Typee, the people of the Marquesas, or one tribe, one community within the Marquesas, calls him. I assume his name might be Tom or something that's never really clearly defined, but that's how he goes by. He's the narrator, though, so it's always in first person. So he's just a narrator, so he's the one we get the story through, and he takes on different roles throughout the novel. So he starts out as a sailor, then he's a work resister, and then he's sort of a pioneer into unknown lands, and then finally he's in like an ethnographer, and then he's also a very conflicted captive. So he takes on many roles throughout the novel, and it's kind of interesting to follow his track. I don't think he has a clear character arc, so to speak, other than he comes to like the people he's staying with, and he comes to appreciate them despite feeling under threat constantly because of rumors that the Typee are cannibals and confirmation later on that they are, and he's always concerned that he's possibly going to be a victim of it, even though that's not really a serious threat that he's facing. He also just wants to get back to his own world. He realizes he can't really assimilate into Typee society as much as they might like to have him there. So by the end of the novel, he's able to get back to quote unquote civilization, but it's a ship. So that leads right into the next novel, Omu. Another character we meet is Toby. Toby is another sailor on the whaling ship who's also disgruntled and unhappy with the way things are, and so Melville leaves with him, and they desert together, and they help each other early on. He kind of leaves the story about halfway through because he kind of goes to get help, and he doesn't come back. But Melville does add like a epilogue where he talks about the story of what happened to Toby. Toby's a bit more of a humorous character. He does have some comic relief roles in the novel. He's more the one who really is frightened of the Typee and wants to leave as soon as possible. Melville's, the narrator, I should say, Tomu, is a little bit more willing to work with. He's a little more fascinated by the society. He sees them in the Typee, and he wants to learn more about it, so he stays behind. Then we have a whole bunch of characters who are Marquesan. We have Marjejo, who is the chief of the Typee. Kori is the kind of the major domo who's been assigned to Tomu to help him out. He's like a young warrior who's been given this job of basically helping Tomu along and help him translate and things like that. And another prominent character is Fayaway. Fayaway is, in a sense, sort of the love interest of the story. She's the beautiful young Pacific Islander, the real titillating figure, the one, if anyone, who's going to be the one who can keep Tomu in the Marquesas. Here's how Fayaway is introduced. I must accept the beautiful beautifus nymph Fayaway, who is my peculiar favorite. Her free, pliant figure was the very perfection of female grace and beauty. Her complexion was a rich and mantling olive, and when watching the glow upon her cheeks, I could almost swear that beneath the transparent medium there lurked the blushes of a faint vermilion. The face of this girl was a rounded oval, and each feature as perfectly formed as the heart or imagination of man could desire. Her full lips, when parted with the smile, disclosed teeth of a dazzling whiteness, and when her rosy mouth opened with a birth of merriment, they looked like the milk-white seeds of an arta, a fruit of the valley, which when cleft in twain shows them reposing in rows on either side, embedded in the red and juicy pulp. Her hair was the deepest brown, parted irregularly in the middle, flowed in natural ringlets over her shoulders, and whenever she chanced to stoop, fell over and hid from view her lovely bosom. Gazing into the depths of her strange blue eyes, when she was in a contemplative mood, they seemed most placid yet unfathomable. When illuminated by some lively emotion, they beamed upon her beholder like stars. The hands of Fayaway were as soft and delicate as those of any countess, for an entire exemption from rude labor marks the girlhood and even prime of a Typee woman's life. Her feet, though wholly exposed, were as diminutive and fairly shaped as those which peep from the skins of a Lima lady's underdress. And he goes on and on. He's got a whole page in this novel just simply describing how beautiful Fayaway is. And she's sort of the love interest of the character. And she's the female presence that we get in this very male environment. In fact, that's something Melville sort of struggles with in these early novels, is kind of putting female characters in prominent roles. Anyways, that's just some of the characters. We have a lot more interesting Marquesan or Typee characters, like a woman who really represents the embodiment of the anti-work ethic, so to speak. Or no, sorry, it's the woman who embodies the work ethic within a culture that's leisure-based, or at least from the European perspective, leisure-based. We have a lot of side characters, both in the French Empire, because this was, of course, part of the French Empire being incorporated into the French Empire at the time. We have discussions of missionaries. There's a man named Mehevi, who's kind of another king of the Typee. A great warrior is there as well. So there's an interesting cast of characters that we're exposed to. Now, the structure of the novel is sort of a straight-up adventure tale, but it has different parts, and you see the narrator putting on different hats at different times as he goes through the story. Often he's just taking on the role as the anti-imperial polemicist, arguing against empire, against missionaries, against the negative impact that Europeans are having. And this is going to be a major theme of the novel, is the corrupting and odious aspects of European culture, and especially how Europeans taint and pervert beauty and purity of the Marquesans. And this is even something that gets involved with issues of sexuality. For instance, they seem to be freer sexually than European culture, but when missionaries come in and ban their indigenous customs, the result becomes decadence and perversion. And you see kind of something that's presented as beautiful and pure, a kind of an innocent libertarian sexuality, something kind of thing you might see in Coming of Age in Samoa or something like that. That gets replaced by prostitution, essentially. And so this kind of corrupting aspect of the European experience is talked about a lot. And it's almost by the Puritans naming what they see as sinful that it becomes sinful eventually. So he's often doing that, especially in the beginning of the novel and at the end of the novel. He really takes on this role, but it's scattered throughout is this concern that Europeans are going to come in corrupted. And this is part of the anxiety that Tomu has over being in this place at all, because he knows he can be one of those corrupting aspects as well. Then we have the character as an ethnographer, and that takes actually the bulk of the novel. Almost a half of the novel are just ethnographic chapters that you could see in a book of ethnography written at the time. And I've looked at several works that fit that description, and this has very much the style where you'll have chapters on their food, chapters on their dress, chapters on different customs, chapters on their religion and their beliefs. And it pretty much stands on its own as a work of ethnography. Now, I would have to actually read what is said about the real cultures that this society is based on, and how much he's making up and how much is based on actual ethnography. But I do know that Melville read works by missionaries and other visitors to the Marquesas and the Pacific Islands in general, and tried to research that a little bit. So he's not coldly making stuff up. And of course he was there as well. And then on top of all this, we have this adventure story of this man fleeing the ship because the conditions there are just so horrible and odious. And the biggest problem he's facing is there's no clear expectation of when they're going to get back. And I think the thing that tips the character over to the idea that I'm going to desert is when they kill the last chicken and at the end of meat, and then they're left with really bad food. Maggoty bread and things like that. So that's when he decides to leave, and he leaves actually saying that there was a contract broken. He's very American in the sense that he has to justify his desertion and his breaking of the contract by saying they broke the contract first by having us at sea too long. So after deserting, he goes through this very perilous journey into the island, and there's two tribes on the islands. There's like the Hapar and the Typee, and the rumors are that the Typee are cannibals, so they're trying to avoid going to the Typee and trying to find the Hapar land, but they end up in the Typee land. Then there's the meeting this other culture, and then there's the growing anxiety over their place in this society, fear of this cannibalism, fear that they're trying to ensconce him. That's another common motif here, is this fear that I'm going to be stuck there. And actually Tomu's, I think it's his arm is injured, or maybe it was his leg is injured by an animal bite or something, and then that becomes something that ties him to the land. And as he becomes more seduced by Typee society, that leg gets worse. And then as he gets more resilient in his effort to leave, it gets better. And it kind of works as a symbol. And then finally he does escape at the end. And there's a kind of a nice action scene at the end where he's running into the water to get to this boat. And the Typee are shooting at him and throwing spears and stuff, trying to get at him. But he gets away at the end by actually kicking one of the Typee warriors off his boat and then getting safely to the whaling ship. And then that's going to seg you right into Omu, where the character takes on the name of Typee. So that's I guess the general feel you'll get from this novel. But it's got it's really thematically rich for being what seems on first glance to be kind of a autobiographical account of these events that happened to him when he was in the South Pacific. One thing that comes throughout this narrative is the terror of empire, the use of force, particularly by the French. But the missionaries are also condemned as well. It's not just the military, but you start out, in fact, when they come to, I think it's Nukuhiva, they come and you actually see these French ships with their cannons pointed at these huts. And this image of the overpowering dominance of the European empire over these societies is pretty clear. And so the terrorism of empire is there, especially at the beginning of the book, in a lot of the background that the narrator gives about how the French came and the early context with them. A much more subtle type of terrorism of empire is this what the missionaries bring, and what the missionaries sort of bring in is sin and their concept of sin, and that becomes a violating force in its own right. Certainly another important theme in the book is the work ethic and work resistance in general. Melville's narrator here we meet him as a work resistor, and he actually goes through quite a lot of pains of justifying why he's ditching the ship. But at the end of the day, he does see himself as someone who's justified in abandoning his work, breaking his contract, and basically quitting his job. So I think it's significant that the first act of one of Melville's characters in all of his novels is to quit his job. And one of his most famous short stories, of course, is Barnaby the Scrivener, whose famous line is, I prefer not to. But you have it in Omu. You have it in, not a little way in Moby Dick, I think. Well, at least there's a tension between kind of voyage for adventure and revenge versus voyage for profit, especially between Starbuck and Ahab. Marty has desertion in it. You have it talked a lot about in Redburn and Whitejacket. So I think this is a major theme of his sea fiction, is work resistance, particularly in Omu, and I'll say more about that next time. And then when we look at what the Marquesian people represent, particularly the Typee, is the anti-work ethic. And that's what Melville constantly talks about, is how they don't really work much, and that's on his mind a lot. And the reason they don't have to work much is they have the breadfruit trees, which provide most of their sustenance. And in fact, he takes the time to point out one woman who's like, I think, a relative of the chief or chief's mother or sister or something, who works very hard. Or maybe it was Corey's mother. She works very hard and diligent, and she's an anomaly in this society. So the character that works hard is presented as a bit oddball. Certainly, I think another theme here is the perception versus the reality. Part of this has to do with cannibalism, right? The image of the cannibal cult, the cannibal tribe, is on their mind when they get off the boat. And the idea is if they're captured, will be eaten. And they get there, and that doesn't happen to them. They kind of like it initially. At least Tomu seems to enjoy a lot about this culture, even though he wants to get back to Europe eventually, or Western culture eventually. But they do learn that eventually they are cannibals, and they do things like eat the flesh of their enemies and things like that. It's more ritualized than they thought. But in the end, the perception did have some truth to it. And the same thing we could say with empire or the missionaries. These are things that have false fronts in Melville's mind, especially I think the missionaries, who maybe they're good-intentioned and well-intentioned and have and are hoping to actually bring something good to the people they meet, but in the end they're actually bringing a corrupting force. And I think it's really fascinating how just almost renaming things becomes something that makes it bad and corrupted. He does a whole thing about the Sandwich Islands, about Hawaii, where he talks about the arrival of the missionaries and the sexuality of the native Hawaiians, and how once it starts getting condemned by the Europeans, this opens up the door to all kinds of perversion. And this, I guess, this ties more broadly to some of the things he says about the impact of Europe in general, and how it's generally a bad influence on these non-European cultures, and something that should be restricted or stopped, because it's really destructive. It's, in his view, it's not really providing that much to them. And in this appendix, he talks about Hawaii, and it's a bit weird. Why is he talking about Hawaii suddenly? But it's thematically tied to the things he talked about in the Marquesas. Because I think the idea is that what happened to Hawaii is going to happen to the Marquesas if we're not careful. Quote, "It is well known that the laws at the Sandwich Islands are subject to the most capricious alterations, which, by confounding all ideas of right and wrong in the minds of the natives, produce the most pernicious effects. In no case is this mischief more plainly discernible than in the continual shifting regulations concerning licentiousness. At one time, in the most innocent freedoms between the sexes are punished with a fine and imprisonment. At another, the revocation of the statute is followed by the most open and undistinguished profligacy. Profligacy? I don't know. Whenever I read this 19th century stuff, I find words I rarely use in my normal speak or writing. So I guess to add to this list of themes, Christianity is a bit banal at this point. But yeah, certainly Christianity is another significant theme here, especially its devious impact. I mean, even the religion of the Typee is presented as very soft and flexible and not really that serious. Yeah, they have idols and things, and he asks about them, but people really don't know much about it. So even their religious customs are kind of loose and not that serious and not rule-based. That's the way Christianity is. Another theme to talk about would be the whaling experience in general. There's not that much of it. It's really in the beginning, and it's just setting up this desertion, this act of desertion. But I think it's important, especially the length of the voyage, the fact that the voyages were open-ended. Merchant ships tended to know when they'd get back, roughly, right? If you're a New York merchant seaman and your job was to, you're on a ship going to London and back, you knew when you'd get back. You could tell your wife that. Whalers couldn't do that. Whalers basically had to go out until they made profit, until they could fill up their ship. If you've seen that movie, The Heart of the Sea, they deal with that theme a little bit. That's about the Essex, which was a voyage that did influence Melville in the writing of Moby Dick. So it's the length, it's just kind of the bad conditions and the unpleasantness, and especially another thing that Tomu has bothered by a lot is kind of the low moral and cultural quality of the people he works with. He doesn't like his coworkers, and he really feels alienated from them. And one reason he tends to work with Toby, or he moves to work with Toby, is Toby seems to have a sense of humor. He seems to be a little more cultured and a little bit, of higher quality. The poor food, and then the arbitrary power of the commander, all these things are listed as grievances earlier in the novel, and I think they're a fair reading of what Melville thinks are some of the problems with the whaling economy and the whole experience of whaling. And then I think finally we can talk about the theme of the cultural contact zone, and this really comes off in the ethnography situations. Of course, for Tomu, the witnessing of Typee society helps him interpret some things about Europe. It helps him understand Europe more, right? And I guess this is one way to understand the so-called contact zones when two cultures meet. It's actually it's a dialectic process where both sides kind of learn about themselves through the interaction and learn about each other. And that certainly happens here. It happens in terms of language. It happens in terms of religion, in food, in preparation, clothing. But then there's limits to it. And like for Tomu, one big thing is not dressing like the Typee. He doesn't want to change his clothing because that'd be like going too far into the, across that boundary. At the same time, you don't see the Typee doing much to incorporate European ideas. But there are characters from time to time who do have like European trinkets and artifacts and things they've collected over time. So those are just some of the themes in Typee. If you want to know more of my thoughts about this very interesting novel, you can go to my podcast, It's at 100pages.podbean.com, and I'll put the link below for the actual Typee episodes, but you can just go there and search for Typee and you'll come up. I have 3 episodes on it, about an hour, where I give a little bit more detail on some of the chapters, some of the events that happen, and just a little bit more about the characters and actually the step-by-step what happens in the novel. But this is just a way to kind of introduce some of the themes and give my overall impression on it. I think this is certainly one of Melville's most memorable books. There's actually books, I like Marty and Omu for a lot of ways, but this is one that's really easy to come back to, and it speaks to us today partially because of the very strong anti-imperial message, and having now we're kind of far enough past the age of the European empires to think more critically about these experiences. We can start to see the long-term impacts of European imperialism, when we can judge whether Melville was right about what happened to these societies over time. And we're still facing the impact of what we do in the West, what people in the West are doing, what impact that's having on the people of the Pacific Islands, especially now with climate change and rising sea levels in the oceans, and concerns about whole nations being destroyed in the Pacific. I think it's also very interesting because it talks about work, which is something, if you've been watching listen to my podcast, or especially watching to my Philip Dick series, it's a lot of my mind is the work ethic and work resistance, and how we can come to terms with automation and how we can balance the work ethic and leisure and these kinds of things. And it's something that our characters in this novel deal with. And on top of that, it's just a great adventure tale. So anyways, Typee. Don't have to get the Library of America version. There are many different ways you can get it. The book's in the public domain, so it's probably a Project Gutenberg. It's at LibriVox if you like audiobook versions. And it's one of Melville's books that you can find relatively easy in print, just at bookstores or wherever you get books. But libraries should have it too. So I recommend it. I think it's a great introduction to Melville. And even if you didn't like some of his other works, I think this one still has, it just has a lot to offer. So I recommend it. If you're a student of maritime issues, if you're interested in sea fiction, if you're interested in adventure tales, if you're interested in the Pacific, there's a lot of ways you might find your interest intersecting with the themes explored in Typee. So with that, I'll just go. I'll be back shortly with probably some other Melville works. I'll look at least Omu and say a little bit about Marty, and try to make a case for why Marty is relevant to us. But anyways, thank you so much for listening. And if you enjoyed this, please leave your comments below and subscribe to my channel. I'll be coming out with a lot more content over the next few weeks and months on American writers, and particularly Philip Dick, but other American writers that I'm reading, and kind of as I work my way through my collection of American literature. So thanks again, and I'll see you next time.